If you recover and don't come back here, that will be the best thank you to me. Lucas Grant, one of the most powerful entrepreneurs in the tech industry, suddenly collapsed during an important meeting. The chair creaked, then crashed to the floor with a sharp, cold sound. The entire room was instantly thrown into panic, but no one dared to move him. Just moments later, an ambulance rushed in with the blaring sound of sirens, taking him away, carrying with it a silent prayer from those left behind. St. John's Hospital at night, with only the dim light of the hallway reflecting off the cold walls, seemed to try to dispel the heaviness in the air. Dr. Claire, who specialized in handling critical emergency cases, quickly entered the patient's room, her sharp eyes immediately realizing that this was no ordinary case. Though she had never heard his name, the expressionless face, the tired, half-closed eyes, warned her that this was not a simple situation. She quickly took notes and began her examination. 10 minutes later, Lucas opened his eyes, his trembling hands and sharp pain slicing through his body. His gaze, cold and indifferent, as if everything was meaningless, stopped on Claire. "Will you be all right?" Claire asked, her voice gentle but still holding the worry she couldn't conceal. Lucas nodded weakly, his gaze directed towards the phone lying on the bedside table, his eyes full of determination. "My phone. I need to get it back." Claire did not respond immediately. She looked at the monitors, noticing that his pulse was still unstable, his blood pressure low, and his body exhausted after the long unconsciousness. "You need to rest. If you don't get treatment, it could be life-threatening," Claire said, her voice firm, like a warning that couldn't be ignored. She knew that, no matter how much power, money, or fame he had, health couldn't be bought. Lucas remained silent, his eyes still fixed on his phone. The pain in his body felt like something bigger than his rational mind, the anger rising, making him feel as if he was trapped in his own body. He was a decisive person, always at the forefront and never backing down, but this time, the feeling of weakness was something he couldn't resist. "I can't stay here long." Lucas tried to sit up, his voice tense. "My company is on the verge of bankruptcy. Every decision I make, every action I take affects thousands of people, thousands of employees out there. You don't understand." Claire looked at him, her gaze full of disappointment. She understood that not everyone could grasp the pain of a person who lived for their work, but it was that same work that had brought them to the brink of exhaustion. She shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. "You have to understand that if you don't take care of yourself, no company can save you. A company can exist without you, but if you're gone, everything ends." Lucas said nothing, his gaze still fixed on something within himself. The suffocating feeling in his chest was like a bomb waiting to explode. But a part of him also realized that Claire was right. And from that moment, a gradual change began to form in him, not from reason, but from the deeper parts of him that he had never faced. The first confrontation between a person accustomed to commanding and a person who didn't know how to bend opened the door to a complex connection between them. A connection that, perhaps, neither of them could yet imagine, would change everything. When Claire stepped out of the patient's room, a strange feeling arose within her. The patients she had cared for, those like Lucas, always placed work above everything else. But this time, Lucas was different. That feeling sparked in her heart, something she couldn't explain, but she could feel it deeply within her. Lucas Grant, still immersed in his work, had agreed to stay in the hospital for 2 days. In reality, he had no other choice. Despite his body being exhausted, his mind couldn't stop. The feeling of pressure, the heavy responsibility like a stone crushing his chest, made him unable to break free from work. Instead of resting, he tried to work from his hospital bed, constantly checking emails, making calls, and discussing with executives via video calls. Everything around him seemed to fade away. On the second day, as an important meeting was approaching, Lucas struggled to sit up, his trembling hands tapping on the keyboard. He felt so tired that his head was spinning, but he couldn't stop. He had to finish everything before leaving, even though his health was still fragile. Just a few minutes later, when he collapsed and could no longer control his body, Lucas fell back onto the bed, unconscious. Claire rushed into the room, seeing him lying there, pale and gasping for breath. She didn't hesitate, immediately calling for the doctor and having him rushed to the emergency room. Her hand never left his, as if she let go for even a second, he would slip away from her. In that moment of panic, Claire felt the fragility of life. People like Lucas, with money and power, sometimes had to face weaknesses they couldn't control. And in that moment, she felt his fear. A fear he never showed, but perhaps the greatest fear in his life. Loss. Loneliness. She sat beside the bed, gripping his hand tightly, never letting go. Though her work never allowed her to fall into emotions, Claire couldn't deny the empathy she felt for Lucas. In those quiet moments, she realized that she, too, had lived too long without living for herself. Both Lucas and she lived only for responsibility, for the expectations of the world around them, never once pausing to ask what they truly wanted. In the darkness of the emergency room, only the sound of machines, Lucas's breathing, and Claire's vague thoughts lingered in her heart. When Lucas slowly regained consciousness, his eyes still dazed, as if unable to escape the long, sleepless nights, the feeling of weakness, no longer able to control everything, made him feel strange and confused. Claire was still sitting beside him, never leaving, her gaze soft as she looked at him. "Thank you," Lucas whispered, his voice hoarse, tired. This feeling, the undeniable weakness, made him feel alien to himself. Claire didn't say anything, just smiled gently, her hand still holding his. "Rest. The work will still wait for you," she said, her voice calm, unhurried, not urging him. Little did she know, deep inside, she too was struggling with the question of whether she was living for herself. The silent hours passed in the hospital, and in every moment Lucas began to realize something he had never thought of before. Everyone around him always had a reason, always had a purpose, but no one truly cared about him as a person. People only saw him through his reputation, the power of his company, the meetings, and everything he had built. But Claire, she was here not for work, not for any goal. She was here because she truly cared about him, because he was Lucas, not because of what he had. As for Claire, looking at Lucas, she felt something very different. She saw a man who had forgotten how to live for himself. Like her, he lived to fulfill responsibilities, to maintain power and everything around him. She couldn't help but wonder if he felt the emptiness in his own life just as she had once. And in that moment, between those silent hours, both began to realize that perhaps they were not just patient and doctor. Perhaps, deep within their hearts, both were seeking something greater. A connection, a feeling of not being alone in this stressful life. When Lucas once again closed his eyes and lay peacefully there, Claire couldn't take her eyes off him, unable to ignore the stirring feeling in her heart. She understood. Work and career couldn't always save a person, but people could save themselves if they dared to change, if they knew that sometimes health and love were the most important things. After many days in the hospital, exhausted and drained, Lucas finally had to accept what he had never wanted. He would have to stay until his body fully recovered. But the one thing that never changed in him was his resilience. Even while in the hospital during those days of treatment, he couldn't stop thinking about the company, about everything that awaited him outside. Work still clung to his mind, like a shadow that could not be shaken off. Claire continued to monitor Lucas's health regularly, and with each passing day she noticed small but distinct changes. Lucas's body started to recover, but what surprised her was that he no longer had the bursts of anger he once did, no more impulsive or forceful reactions. Instead, each day he became calmer, as if his time in the hospital had taught him to reconnect with a part of himself that he had never known before. There were times when, as Claire entered to check on him and prepare medical equipment, Lucas would open up, no longer the cold, rigid man focused solely on work and responsibility. Instead, he was someone seeking to heal the deep wounds in his soul. One late night, when the hospital had become quiet, Claire brought a bowl of hot porridge into his room, knowing that Lucas might not want to eat. But she did it anyway, because her concern for him never wavered. Lucas saw her, her eyes tired, but still filled with care. He looked at the bowl of porridge, then let out a faint smile. "Porridge," he said, his voice dry, slightly sarcastic. "Aren't you afraid I'll ask for something more extravagant?" Claire laughed softly, placing the bowl on the table beside his bed. "Even though you could eat a lot of fancy dishes, I'm sure none of them could taste better than this porridge," she said, her gaze gentle. Lucas didn't reply, just quietly looked at the porridge before starting to eat. The warmth and tenderness spread through him, as if he hadn't felt this kind of care in a long time. It wasn't the best porridge he had ever eaten, but it was certainly the most special. "There's a reason I hate people like you," Claire said, her eyes suddenly darkening. "They always forget about their health, constantly chasing after work, not realizing it's slowly eating them alive. I lost my father because of that." Lucas stopped eating, his eyes widening in surprise, as if he had never heard a story like that before. "Your father?" he asked, his voice soft, filled with curiosity. Claire nodded, her face briefly clouding over with the memory. "My father was a man who worked nonstop. He spent his whole life building his career, but in the end, he collapsed before he could finish it all. I never really had time with him. In his last years, he only lived for work, and when he realized that, it was too late." Lucas fell silent, feeling the pain in her words. He wondered if he, too, would one day face this regret when looking back on the life he had lived. He had been like that, ignoring his health, neglecting those close to him, just to conquer the peaks of his career. "Thank you for sharing this," Lucas said, his voice soft and sincere. "I understand. Though I can't change the past, I won't do it again." Claire smiled gently, then turned to leave the room. "It's best if you take care of yourself. Otherwise, there won't be anyone left to protect the company." On the 5th day, Lucas felt that he was well again. His body no longer felt weak as before. Though he was still a little tired, his mind was ready for the challenges ahead. Everything seemed to return to its normal course, but within him, there was a deep change. He no longer felt that work was everything, no longer placed the company and fame above all else. He began to understand that the things that truly mattered in life weren't the things he built, but himself and the people he cared about. In the evening, Lucas called Claire into his room. A smile briefly appeared on his face, but there was also a slight hesitation, as if what he wanted to say was very important. "I'm better now," he said, his voice confident, but with a touch of uncertainty. "I'd like to invite you to dinner. Thank you for everything over the past days." Claire looked at him for a moment, then smiled and gently declined, her gaze warm yet resolute. "No need. If you recover and don't return here, that will be the best thank you," she said, gently but sincerely. Lucas watched her leave, feeling warmth in his heart. Her refusal didn't make him sad. On the contrary, He felt that he had been seen, that he had been understood, something he had never experienced throughout his life. As Claire walked out of the room, Lucas sat alone. A strange sense of peace enveloped him. It was a shift in the way he viewed life. And perhaps this was the first step of a new journey he had to take, a journey not just to find himself, but to live true to who he was. Although Lucas had gradually resumed his work, deep within his soul, he could not stop thinking about Claire. She was the only one who did not see him as a symbol of power or a famous entrepreneur, but as an ordinary man with his own pains and wounds. This feeling, a vague emotion that he could not explain, had started to spark in his heart. A feeling he didn't know how to face or admit. He decided that, if possible, he would find a way to express this, even if it were just a small gesture. He entrusted this task to Rachel, his loyal secretary who was always ready to do anything for him. "Buy a beautiful bouquet of flowers and bring it to Claire," Lucas said, his voice betraying both anticipation and anxiety. Rachel heard his request, and immediately, an unfamiliar sensation crept into her heart. She realized what Lucas had not said. He had started to like Claire. And whether she admitted it rationally or not, she could not hide the jealousy rising within her. Rachel couldn't stand seeing him give attention to another woman, especially when she had always been by his side, loyal and dedicated all these years. Then, in a fleeting moment, a deceitful thought appeared in Rachel's mind. She knew that if Lucas gave the flowers to Claire, she might lose the opportunity she had secretly longed for. So, instead of fulfilling Lucas's request, Rachel decided to change everything. She didn't give the flowers to Claire. Instead, she lied, saying that Claire had refused the flowers because she had a boyfriend. A sense of victory rose in Rachel's heart, but deep inside, a feeling of guilt was impossible to conceal. Lucas received the information from Rachel, and a strange sense of emptiness overcame him. It wasn't that he didn't understand that Claire might not want to accept the flowers, but because he felt he had lost an opportunity. Deep down, he knew he wasn't ready to face his emotions, but he could not deny the emptiness and disappointment welling up inside him. After the incident, Lucas threw himself back into work, as if it were the only thing that could fill the void in his heart. He immersed himself in meetings, in every little detail of the company's restructuring plan, as a way to avoid facing the unfamiliar emotions about Claire. He didn't dare to let himself feel anymore, as doing so might make him weak, something he always avoided. But the change in Lucas did not escape his older brother Thomas. Thomas was the only one who understood Lucas better than anyone else. He noticed that his brother was no longer the decisive, strong person he used to be. Lucas now seemed like a person who had lost his vitality, someone who only had work left to escape from the things that hurt him. One afternoon, Thomas decided to arrange a surprise meeting with someone he believed could help Lucas find balance in his life. She was a talented, beautiful doctor, but like Lucas, she had been so consumed by work that she had never found love for herself. Thomas believed that this woman could help Lucas open up, help him rediscover a part of himself that he had long forgotten. When Lucas received the invitation from his brother, he could not refuse. Though he didn't know who he would be facing, he felt that a part of him still hoped to find someone for himself. A part of him sensed that this might be the opportunity he needed to change, to step out of the darkness he had built for himself. Brooklyn, the warm lights of the small restaurant reflected off the water in the fish tank by the window. The aroma of the dishes spread through the quiet space, where the only sounds were soft conversations and the clinking of knives and forks against plates. Lucas sat there, his gaze fixed on the menu, but he was hardly focused. The unfamiliar and uncomfortable feeling still lingered around him since his brother suggested this meeting. He wasn't sure why he was here, maybe just to escape work, or perhaps to search for something he had missed. But when the waiter led him to the table, his heart suddenly raced. Claire walked in, her familiar figure in a simple yet elegant black dress, the light from the chandelier shining on her glossy brown hair, creating a captivating picture. When their eyes met, they both froze, neither speaking for a few long, lingering seconds. Lucas opened his mouth, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. "You have a boyfriend, don't you?" He was surprised and couldn't hide his astonishment. Claire stared at him for a moment, then furrowed her brow, her face showing no sign of awkwardness. "Who said that?" she asked, her voice firm. "I haven't dated anyone in years." The silence stretched on, and no one said anything further. Rachel's words suddenly shattered in Lucas's mind. He realized she had lied. The sense of emptiness, the thoughts that couldn't be grasped, all settled in his chest. But perhaps more importantly, Claire not only didn't have a boyfriend, but she also admitted that she hadn't dated anyone in a long time. That made Lucas's heart momentarily stop, then beat faster. They both stood still, as if time had stopped in that moment, and only the sound of their gentle breaths broke the stillness. In that moment, Lucas realized something important. He wasn't the only one who had felt something. Maybe Claire also thought about him. Perhaps, amidst the brief conversations and late-night meals, she had also felt some kind of connection. Then Claire sat down, her gaze no longer guarded like before. She smiled softly, but in that smile, there was something tender, something familiar. "Sorry if I surprised you," she said, unable to hide the small smile as she looked at Lucas. Lucas was still trying to compose himself, looking at her in a strange way, as if he were trying to piece together the fragments of his life. He gently moved the chair and sat across from her, but his mind was still spinning. "No, it's fine," Lucas said, his voice hoarse, as if saying these words was something very difficult. "I just didn't expect us to meet like this." Claire nodded quietly, saying nothing more. She still looked at him with understanding. An indescribable silence enveloped the space between them, but it was a meaningful silence, where emotions that had never been expressed began to creep into their hearts. As the meal neared its end, Lucas stood up and took a bouquet of flowers that had been prepared for some time, placing them on the table. It was a bouquet of pure white flowers, elegant and simple, much like his feelings at that moment. "This is for you," he said, his voice low but clear. "Sorry for the delay." Claire looked at the bouquet, then back into his eyes. She didn't say anything, just smiled softly. Her feelings were strange now. She could see the sincerity in Lucas's eyes, could see what he wanted to say but hadn't yet said. She silently reached out to take the bouquet, neither refusing nor hesitating. This time, there was no refusal. Claire held the bouquet, her eyes lighting up with a warmth she could not hide. Lucas looked at her, exhaling lightly, as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. And in that moment, both of them knew that this was the beginning of something new, something they had waited for a long time, but had never dared to admit.